Good afternoon. Welcome to the latest in the series of webinars sponsored by the Eno Center for Transportation. I'm Emil Frankel. I'm a senior fellow at Eno. Today we're going to be discussing infrastructure and COVID-19 and the various COVID bills and the possibilities and opportunities of a stimulus package being part of a COVID bill. Our speaker today is Dr. Rick Geddes. Rick is a professor of policy analysis and management at Cornell, and he's the founding director of Cornell's program in infrastructure policy. He researches the funding and operation of heavy civil and social infrastructure with a focus on the adoption of new technologies. His research has examined network-wide road pricing, infrastructure resilience, and innovative infrastructure financing through private-public partnerships. He is also a visiting scholar at AEI, the American Enterprise Institute, and a research fellow with the Mineta Transportation Institute at San Jose State University. Rick was a member of the Transportation Infrastructure Policy Commission that worked and reported approximately 10 or 12 years ago, and he was really one of the outstanding and important members of that commission, which is when I fortunately had the opportunity to get to know him. There'll be plenty of time for questions at the end of Rick's presentation. Please feel free to enter questions in the question box, not the chat box, but the question box on the side of your screen at any time. We'll get to as many of your questions as we can after Rick's presentation. And with that, Rick Geddes, thank you.
Many thanks, Emil. Thank you for that kind introduction, and many thanks to Eno for the invitation to speak in this webinar today entitled What COVID-19 Stimulus Packages Promise for Infrastructure. I'm going to try to maximize the amount of time we have for Q&A, so I'll just tee up a few things with some slides and try to keep my oral remarks down, because I want to know what all our listeners want to speak about. But I'll just try to drive home 3 points that I think are critical for thinking about COVID-19, the COVID pandemic, and what it might, how it might impact an infrastructure bill. I think certainly COVID-19 and the subsequent economic effects are going to exacerbate America's pressing infrastructure funding problem. Note that infrastructure funding refers to all the different revenue sources we have from user fees. And that was really a major problem before COVID came along. I always distinguish that from financing. And I think that's going to be even worse after COVID. And we might discuss some ways a bill could help address that. I know there's some talk about infrastructure being part of a stimulus bill. There's, I think, a good bit of evidence now, and I can give some conceptual reasons as well as data, why I think infrastructure makes for poor economic stimulus, and why that is probably, we should think about an infrastructure bill as an opportunity to adopt improved policy, but not necessarily as being effective, being very counter-cyclical and effective in economic stimulus when you need it. However, I think the good news is that COVID-19 is really an opportunity to improve infrastructure delivery in the United States. I probably don't have to tell this audience about the systemic problems we have in terms of poor deferred maintenance, project selection, slow adoption of technology, et cetera. But I think there's a lot of good things we could do in a bill that would incentivize things like asset recycling, which I believe has been used successfully in Australia, more value capture and other forms of innovative finance. In addition to public-private partnerships, I think PPPs are part of that, but there's a lot of other things we can do on the innovative finance level that I'm happy to discuss. This next slide is really my only slide I'll do that's kind of geeky in the sense of an academic, sort of view, but I think it's useful for listeners. I tell this to my students, to divide infrastructure funding into 3 major categories. And then in this context, we can think about which of these do you think is going to be most impacted by COVID? Which of the types of funding sources do you think is going to bounce back the quickest after we emerge from the COVID crisis. And really the way we categorize this is based on how correlated to use of the infrastructure facility the source of funding is. The first bucket, I would say these are 3 buckets. The first bucket is some type of user fee that's highly correlated to use. And as Emil indicated in his introduction, I've done some writing on network-wide real-time congestion pricing of roads. And of course, most people on the call are probably familiar with mileage-based user fees, tolls, congestion prices, tolls that vary in real time. We can have a debate about how much of a user fee the gas tax or the diesel tax is and how that's changing over time. Typically, that's put in the first bucket. The second is some type of a targeted tax that is somewhat related to use. Tax increment financing or value capture might fall into that second bucket. And the third is really broad-based taxes that are generally unrelated to use of the facility at all, that really are not, to an economist's mind, user fees or prices or anything of that nature, but they do sometimes help to fund infrastructure. So this sales taxes might be included that are dedicated to state DOTs, property taxes at the local level, et cetera. So it's useful, I think, as we think about COVID and how we might respond after emerging from this, how these different types might bounce back, what's going to be most impacted. Maybe it's just useful to have these 3 categories in mind. Okay, so I'll just note that prior to COVID, the United States had a very large funding gap, which the dedicated revenues, from all those different sources being less than those needed to maintain a state of good repair for the infrastructure. I think that the virus is going to exacerbate. That's not a heroic prediction. I think it's pretty clear that the virus is going to exacerbate that pre-existing funding gap. Maybe that means this is an opportunity for even more innovation in a bill. That's what I would like to see. Just some examples, of course. I think revenues from gas, I haven't seen the data, but revenues from gas and diesel taxes flowing into the Highway Trust Fund are going to be have declined enormously because of the, people are not commuting to work, to the store, et cetera. Just in effect, of course, transit ridership is a big issue. Looking at New York subways, of course, ridership's down something like 95%, BART ridership down 97%. And the question here, of course, is to what degree are these going to be long run impacts? In other words, to what degree is COVID going to change behavior in the longer run versus just a short-term impact, pretty much due to the shutdown? So I think that's a general question that infrastructure policy people should keep in mind: is do we think that the telecommuting, the increased use of webinars like this one, of Zoom, et cetera, are going to make people more comfortable with working from home and maybe shifting their commuting times, et cetera, or even shifting their modes in the longer run? And to what degree do we think it's just a short run impact and people will go back to what they were doing before? I think the best answer is that no one knows, but of course we can make some predictions and think about that, because that's going to have a big effect on how we should think about infrastructure going forward. Okay, so that's the infrastructure. So I think thinking about a bill, the major question for a bill, at least in my mind, is not necessarily whether it's going to be part of a stimulus or not. I think the major question is going to be, how are you going to pay for it? And whether the bill is going to be fully paid for by the revenue streams that we have, or is it going to be debt financed? I think at this point, at least part of it is going to be debt financed, but the question is how much? And of course, if you believe that the Highway Trust Fund revenues and gas and diesel and truck tire taxes and other things should be paying for the bill, that would constrain the size of the bill. And this is where I think infrastructure policy can play a big role, in that it would be nice to see a bill include innovative policies that incentivize new sources of funding. So this is state and local infrastructure asset owners who are focusing on raising additional revenue from their existing infrastructure assets. So I'll give a couple of examples of that in the next few slides. So One thing I want to address kind of directly is the question. I know a number of listeners probably have the question of, should infrastructure be part of a larger economic stimulus? Here, I think there's been previous work written about this, but a particularly timely report came out earlier this month, earlier in May, and it's from the Congressional Research Service, and it's entitled Transportation Infrastructure Investment as Economic Stimulus. So obviously this is directly on point with what a lot of commentators are bringing up, which is the use of this. And this really focuses on the Recovery and Reinvestment Act from 2008, after the 2008 global financial crisis, and the stimulus that was introduced, the fiscal stimulus that was introduced after that. And you'll recall that a big part of that was infrastructure. So the CRS did sort of a postmortem on the ARRA and came up with a few conclusions. I urge everyone to read that report because it's important for this question. I think it's important for how we want to structure an infrastructure bill going forward. Infrastructure spending is slower than other types of stimulus. Typically, the report lists other types of stimulus that can get the money out the door so that it is in fact counter-cyclical. And one of the things I thought was interesting about this report is its emphasis on state and local infrastructure owners and how the actual level of investment that is deployed in a state by, say, a state DOT depends on these other entities, which are of course non-federal entities. And if your goal is to get the spending out, a state might just substitute the federal money for its own monies. And in fact, the net effect of the stimulus is reduced. The report states that it was hard to enforce state maintenance of effort requirements. It's hard to make the states do that. And that there were modest effects of the ARRA on infrastructure, on employment from the infrastructure spending in that bill. So there's a number of interesting points there, but I think this directly gets at that. Now, this is not to say, of course, that Congress should not do a bill. In fact, it's timely. Congress should be doing a bill and think about infrastructure as soon as possible, because the FAST Act, as many of us know, expires on, that should be September 30th, 2020, not September 20th. But I think that this provides an opportunity. So we really need to look at the silver lining in this very dark cloud that the COVID virus is giving us. And of course, I think there's universal agreement that there will be severe negative economic consequences of the COVID shutdown. And, we in the infrastructure policy world need to think creatively about that. So what I and others have urged is that a new bill to reauthorize federal spending out of the Highway Trust Fund on transportation, but these concepts hopefully can apply to other types of infrastructure like water and energy, et cetera. I think it's general. Should focus on providing incentives and structures for infrastructure asset owners to realize more value from their existing infrastructure. And let me give you a couple of examples of that, and then I will pretty quickly wrap up so we can get to Q&A. One thing I'm in favor of is a robust asset recycling program that encourages local self-help. So what I mean by that, and I here point to Australia, and I believe that we should at least try what Australia did, which is a 15% bonus, setting aside funds for state and local governments so that they receive 15% on the dollar that they raise by more effectively generating value from their existing infrastructure assets. So where I live up in upstate New York here in Ithaca, one example would be perhaps more effectively managing the real estate portfolio that a state DOT had. Say it could move salt sheds, for example, and other pieces of property to lower value locations, and then either lease or sell those lands and raise money that way. So that would just be one minor example. But then for every dollar that the state raised that way, they would get a 15% bonus. Some folks say this would not do much in terms of incentivizing state and local asset owners to look at new management techniques, but I think it's worth a try. In the United States, it was successful in Australia, and I think certainly a pilot program on this would be good. I think we can do things that incentivize the adoption of new technologies. One thing I've noted in my long years of study of infrastructure is that asset owners, and I think infrastructure financing techniques often, let's say, do not encourage the adoption of new technologies. And there's different things that can be done. Here in Ithaca, a technology company that you would recognize, leading technology company, came in and told the sewage treatment plant that they were wasting a lot of methane. There was methane being released in the process. It's a 100-year-old wastewater treatment plant, and that they could capture that methane with a digester, basically a methane capture, and they could use that to run turbines, which I've had a tour of the plant, and they turn it about 120,000 RPMs, and they generate electricity for the plant, so that the city of Ithaca saves money and captures methane at the same time. And now they actually sell power to the grid. So it's become so efficient, and I could go on more, but that's just an example. Another example would be the adoption of LED lights versus incandescent sodium street lights. And I think the city of Detroit did that, and LEDs provide more brightness, more lumens at a lower cost. So the city can actually save enough money so that it pays for the installation of the new technology. There's also a lot of literature on value-added tolling of interstates. People are probably familiar with that. And giving states, I believe that should be part of a new bill, giving states the ability, or at least the flexibility, to raise more money from user fees. So this will be my final slide. I've talked about this a lot. I wrote a little book back in 2011 for the American Enterprise Institute on private investment and infrastructure. And I am happy to talk about bundling of design and construction with operation and maintenance, and hopefully financing and the benefits of doing that, which a lot of other countries do. One of the things a bill could contain is lifting the cap on private activity bonds, PABs, which would lower the cost or equalize the cost of capital playing field with tax-exempt muni debt, but also allow the private activity bonds to be used on a variety of different infrastructure types. Depending on what listeners want to talk about, one of the things I'm doing research on now with a couple of colleagues, empirical statistical research on the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA, which, as many listeners know, has greatly slowed infrastructure delivery. We've gotten data from the Council on Environmental Quality that it was collected after the ARRA, and the mean time to get permitted is about 4.5 years. So you can get a college degree in less time than it takes to permit the average project. Some projects regularly take 10 years. So I think the lead agency model we can talk about is one important reform that could be included in an act. And Emil, I will close with my favorite policy reform, which is repealing Section 111 of Title 23 that many of us are familiar with, which prohibits states from developing interstate rest stops. Goes back to the 50s, I believe, in its origin. And that's why if you're driving on an interstate at night and you pull up to a rest stop, it's often kind of creepy and dark. Doesn't have shops or restaurants or anything. And that's because of an old section of Title 23. But this would be an example of value capture, where if we did some creative policy reform, states would be able to generate more value from the existing infrastructure. So Emil, I'm going to stop right there and we can go to Q&A.
Thank you, Rick, very much. Before we start with the questions, I do want to remind listeners that to enter questions, many of you already have in the question box, not the chat, but the question box on the side of your screen, and we'll get to as many of them as we can. Possibly we'll kind of combine them. And let me start with a question Rick, which actually captures some of the concerns and questions of many of the people participating in this webinar. Uh, and that is the assistance to the transportation sector, which has come in the earlier, I think it was COVID-3 actually, as I remember, uh, was assistance to transit agencies in particular for their tremendous loss. You touched on the ridership. I know ridership in Metro North in Connecticut and Westchester County is down 95%. That's typical of transit and commuter rail agencies. So there's been a tremendous loss of revenue, and there was money, I think, as I remember, give or take $25 billion for the transit industry to assist them with loss of revenue and to enable them to maintain operations. There are requests pending, additional requests from the transit industry for more money, again, for operations, and from AASHTO on behalf of state transportation agencies, again, to make up for lost revenues, the loss of tax revenues or other dedicated sources, and to allow them to maintain operations. So the focus in the context of the COVID crisis, the current public health crisis, is on maintaining operations as opposed to capital investments. And I wonder if you can comment on that and comment really more specifically on your thoughts about the transit sector and commuter rail and its survivability in the context of this public health crisis.
Yeah, thanks, Emil. There's a lot packed into your question. But let me fall back on my Econ 101 training, which I'm always urging my students to do. And one of the things I think that is so useful as we try to analyze the massive, let's all agree that there are going to be massive effects of the COVID-19 virus and the subsequent shutdown, et cetera, on the structure of the economy. But I think it's very useful to separate those effects, just as a first cut, into the short-term impacts of the shutdown and the social distancing and the fear of catching the virus, et cetera, versus longer-term structural changes to the economy, which I alluded to, in my slides. And I think almost certainly there's a short-term operational impact in terms of loss of fare box revenue by the transit agencies, on because of the virus. And I think, what it really does is the question, Emil, economically is, should that risk be borne by the transit agencies, or is that something we want to shift on to taxpayers? So I think in terms of, we don't want them declaring bankruptcy on a large, scale. So obviously, some sort of an infrastructure bill, I think it would be appropriate to include, whether you call it a bailout, whatever you call it, in terms of a short-term assistance to those agencies, so they just don't, face a catastrophe. Excuse me. But longer term, Emil, I think we need to view this as an opportunity to consider the structure of transportation infrastructure in the United States. And there's a lot of innovations now going on in mobility. Of course, driverless cars is something that gets a lot of news, but there's a lot of other innovative companies that are using technology, using various smartphone apps to optimize bus routes. It's kind of like ride sharing with Uber or Lyft that people are familiar with, but on a slightly larger scale with maybe 10 or 12 people, in the vehicle. But the route of the bus is optimized in real time instead of doing a fixed route, to pick up people as they call the bus or whatever we want to call it, to pick them up. So I guess my point is, Emil, that longer term, we need to be rethinking, the structure of this. I'm happy to talk about other elements of your question, like Amtrak specifically, or intercity passenger rail, versus commuter rail. But I think for listeners to just divide it up into these short-term impacts versus longer-term structural changes is like the best first step in the analysis.
That's actually a good springboard to a question that has come in, and let me read it. And you touched on this a little bit in terms of funding mechanisms, but specifically, what impact will this pandemic have on the future of funding mechanisms and really financing mechanisms more than funding, debt and equity, considering the huge impact to usage we have seen in major infrastructure assets like toll roads and airports? Uh, Again, I mentioned also that the Trade Association for Toll Authorities is also seeking funding, again, because of the tremendous loss of revenue. You and I touched on this earlier, but some of the PPPs, which had been finally meeting their traffic projections and therefore their revenue projections on which their whole financing packages depended, have lost tremendous, at least in the short run, tremendous toll revenues. So what impacts do you think those will have, or are they just really likely to be short-term impacts?
Yeah, again, Emo, it's a terrific question, and it really gets down to what of the effects of COVID and the subsequent economic impacts are, changes in people's underlying behavior, right, as a result of this, and whether it's being more comfortable with meeting technology or just being more flexible in their commuting times. Is very, very hard to predict that, right? But I know that's an unsatisfying answer. But one of the things, Emo, I think, I don't want to give an instant answer as to whether I think there should be, taxpayer support for toll authorities, et cetera. I'd have to think about that. But what I would urge listeners to do, again, is to have a more general, broader framework. And, basically, it's a question of risk allocation, right? I mean, the impacts of the virus on the economy are enormous. And which of those impacts is correctly shifted to taxpayers? Clearly, some of that is, right? To hopefully smooth out business cycles, et cetera, versus what is correctly allocated to other participants. And, whoever that could be, asset owners, it could be private investors, whatever it is. I guess my general point is that the way to think about that question is as a risk allocation question. Right. And I know it's a bit of a cop out, but I'd have to think through the answer specifically for the toll agencies issue.
Yeah, I'm sure many of the private ventures who are parts of PPPs would view this as, or some of them may view this as kind of an act of God, and that it would relieve them from some of the risks that they assumed when they entered into these transactions.
It's interesting you bring that up, Emil, because I have talked to some folks who deal with, say, airport P3s a lot more than I do, and those force majeure clauses, which were always, I guess, sort of standard in a lot of the P3 contracts. Everybody's taking a much more careful look at exactly how those clauses were drafted. Again, they allocate risk, right? Some of them talk about what is an epidemic, what does quarantine mean exactly, right? And so yes, the force majeure clauses have become much more important.
Going back to the CRS, the Research Service recent analysis of the Recovery Act in 2009, can you cite other evidence that makes other analysis of the Recovery Act that suggests infrastructure spending makes for poor economic stimulus? Was the Congressional Research Service's conclusion a function of the Recovery Act specifically, or was it more a general reference to infrastructure spending? I mean, we are fond, obviously, of referring to the New Deal and the Public Works Administration and other efforts by FDR's administration. They're seen as key elements of the New Deal. So were your comments and CRS's comments about the limitations of infrastructure as immediate infrastructure spending as immediate relief apt to the current situation?
Yeah. So Emil, my view is that for projects that are, it depends on the type of project. In other words, if the goal is to do the project quickly, to get money out the door, then that's going to limit the type of projects to specific things that DOTs can do easily that they're familiar with, right? If it's more what I think a lot of people in the call, would think of as major projects, transformational projects, as I said, they might take over 4 years to get permitted. Perhaps that NEPA process could be sped up in certain cases, but typically by the time that big project is ready to go, the business cycle has recovered, right? So if you want something that's counter-cyclical, it has to be faster. But the other point I'll make, Emil, and this is just personal, reading and observations of mine, is that nowadays a lot of infrastructure projects are highly automated, right? There's a lot more robotics, there's a lot more automation. So in terms of, people think back to the 1930s when you had, it's actually teams of women carrying rebar, out to build highways. And that was true on the interstate highway construction as well. It was labor intensive. And so now we've moved to a much more capital intensive type of production technology for a lot of infrastructure. And so employment effects, which they found in CRS, but this is more general, I think, are likely to be pretty limited. So if your goal is to reduce unemployment and get people back to work, I'm not sure that infrastructure is the way to go. Now, having said that, I think Congress should do a bill. It can include really important policy changes, and I outlined a few of those in my slides.
Well, thank you, Rick, very much. We've unfortunately run out of time and reached only a few of the questions. I hope, let me mention to all those of you participating in this webinar that you can find slides, Rick's slides, and a recording of the webinar on ENO's website, which is enotrans.org. And you can also, let me say, at the same time, sign up for ENO Transportation Weekly. Many of you have and do read it on a regular basis. It's a valuable resource for all things in transportation. The webinar recording will also be emailed directly to all the people who registered today. Let me also mention that we have 2 other webinars ENO does scheduled for this week. Tomorrow at 1:15 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time, we'll have the next of ENO's Road to Recovery webinars. Tomorrow's will be with Rob Britton, and an expert in aviation. He'll be talking about crisis management, if you will, in the aviation sector, both airports and airlines. We also will have a webinar on ENO's latest report, which is on congestion pricing. And that webinar is scheduled for Thursday of this week at 2 p.m. Thank you again, Rick, for your participation in this webinar. And thank you to all of you who listened and asked questions. Have a great afternoon. Stay well, stay safe, and don't forget to wear your face masks and maintain physical distance. Thank you.
Thanks, Emil.